Well, good morning, everybody. I kind of wonder what I'm doing here, actually, because more than 90% of my time is devoted to the system that we discovered, the ubiquitin system, which is a system that is using a protein called ubiquitin. It's a small, highly evolutionarily conserved protein that modifies other proteins by attaching to them covalently. We got to it by studying protein degradation. So one of the functions of ubiquitin is to tag proteins for their death. So they make them recognizable by a downstream protease called the 26S proteasome that degrades them. But apparently ubiquitin plays many other major roles, like phosphorylation, and it tags proteins for many other functions. So I wonder whether the epigenetic people will agree also to include ubiquitination in epigenetic control, because if you try to think of epigenetic in the broad sense of the word, it's basically broadening the information that is embedded in the DNA. And you are doing it many ways, by methylating DNA, but you're doing it also by numerous post-translational modifications that proteins are undergoing, from acetylation to amidation and amination and phosphorylation and whatever, though it's clearly different in concept than what you are used to think of epigenetic control, because those modifications some of them are extremely short-lived, like phosphorylation, kinases phosphorylate proteins and then phosphatases dephosphorylate proteins, or even if they are eternal, so-called, like acetylation at the end termini of protein, they are persisting only for the lifetime of the protein, and once the protein is degraded, the modification is gone with it. So I'm not sure that this belongs really to epigenetics, but it's part of my justification of being here. So I have to use it. The other reason that I became very much interested in personalized medicine, and I think that there is an overlap between personalized medicine and gender medicine. Personalized medicine is, of course, doesn't have the boundaries of gender because it's personal. We are testing or checking the repertoire of an individual patient, regardless of the gender, and trying to find the reason for the disease, let it be genetic, epigenetic, mutational, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of another justification why I'm here. So what you see here is the beautiful city of Haifa, and you see the medical school. It's the white building on the left side, sitting just on the bay, and my laboratory looks into the sea. It's really a beautiful city, and the gardens that you see are not just part of the mountain, but they are part of the Baha'i gardens that the Baha'i built in Haifa. Actually, they built their shrine and they acquired the land much before the country became a country. And then they built there the burial place of their prophet. Another part is in Akko, which is a city about 25 kilometers north of Haifa. And in many ways, Haifa became the capital of the Baha'i. They were persecuted in Iran and found rescue and shelter in Israel. Okay. So what I decided to do, I'm sure that all the facts that I'm going to tell you are very well known to you, and I hope you are not going to find them boring, but I'm trying to wrap them up in a kind of a 30,000 feet view, the historical roots of personalized medicine, and mostly moving more from the technological aspects of it that we are used to investigate when we are on the laboratory bench, into bioethical issues that are coming up, and they are very heavy, like genetic information, the leakage of genetic information, what does it mean to society, and so on. So I'll try to kind of examine it both historically and ethically from 30,000 feet. I think that the first issue is, of course, lifespan. If you think about our lifespan, you go 4,000 years ago to old Egypt and Greece and Rome, people lived on the average 30 years, 35 years. They died of everything. There was no medicine, basically, as we know it today. It took about 4,000 years almost to bring lifespan to 50. And merely 120 years ago, at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, the lifespan was about 50 years. People died of infections. There was no antibiotics. A woman died during delivery. We didn't know anything about blood type, surgery, nothing. And then in one single century, in the 20th magic century, we managed to extend lifespan by 30 to 35 years. So we added more than 60% to our lifespan. This is extremely interesting, but the reasons are no, it's all science and technology. We don't have to go into it. From vaccination to antibiotics to development of medicine at large, diet, sport, exercise, and so on and so forth. All these factors came together. Imaging, of course, the technology of imaging came together. And the interesting question is whether the trend is going to be continued, whether we are flattening the curve, and so on and so forth. Of course, there are many societal issues behind. I just discussed it with Marek this morning. People at my age, were not alive 100 years ago. So what we are going to do with that? People are retiring at the age of 65, 67. This is coming from Bismarck days. And people feel very young at that age. So what to do about it? And of course, the development of diseases, of the diseases that affect the Western world is mostly, all the diseases are basically age-related diseases. Think about the big diseases, from malignancies to neurodegeneration to degeneration of the vascular system, heart diseases, metabolic diseases. Most of them are age-related diseases. And the burden of the so-called, to be politically correct, the more advanced age on the economy of health is going to be huge. So on one hand, employment, we are retiring too early. On the other hand, if you are looking at the insurance curves, the expenses of insurance, I have not spent nothing almost of my health insurance during my 7.5 centuries walking on the face of earth, but I'm probably going to spend it during the very last phases of my life. So the expenditure at the time that people are less productive on health is going to be huge, and it's already huge. So these proportions are certainly burdening us, and we need to find a solution to it. But let's just concentrate on lifespan and on the predictions of lifespan. There was a Nature paper a few years ago that predicted that lifespan is going to be like 110, 115 years, and then we are going to collapse because there is so much that biological system can maintain. But then the technology of CRISPR came. So we are still not using it routinely, but it's there and it's developing. So maybe we shall be able to correct some genes, for example, to repair genes that are responsible for quality control in the brain, to attenuate or even inhibit aggregation of proteins that are the hallmark of all neurodegenerative diseases, almost with no exception, and so on and so forth. So even this guess of 115 was based on mutational rates and the DNA repair system, the DNA damage repair system, and so on, not bringing into consideration other developments in medicine, so and biology. So we still don't know, but already nowadays we are living about almost 20 years beyond our retirement age, which really poses heavy societal problems. Now, the dream, people are writing on it, cure for all diseases, no hospitals, no medicine, no medical school, no conferences like this one. So is this dream a real one? Well, again, we are scientists and physicians. We cannot predict the future, but looking at the past, yes, we kind of almost overcame or many of infectious diseases. The late pandemic showed us that we are vastly wrong about it, and we should expect more pandemics. But we do have antibiotics, and the world of antibiotics is changing now. Antibacterial agents, I will say, is changing now in front of our eyes. We have overcome a lot of metabolic diseases, or at least slowed them down. Take, for example, diabetes, that the pre-insulin era, people lived for weeks or a few months, and now people are living decades with it, heart diseases, and so on and so forth. So we do know to tackle diseases and at least to extend lifespan. I'm not sure that, the question is whether new diseases are behind the corner, like the major killers that were behind the corner, because 120 years ago, we knew that there is cancer, but it thought people didn't live long enough to get cancer. We knew that there are heart problems, but people didn't live long enough to get in high frequency and high incidence myocardial infarction, and so on and so forth, and Alzheimer or other neurodegenerative diseases. So these are all age-related diseases. What's else beyond the corner, we don't know. There might be some diseases, but I think that with the genome exposed and the gradual exposure of the different functions of proteins, we might be able at least to predict in the future whether big surprises are still behind the corner. But again, you see the world of science is extremely flexible, and for those of you, especially for the Americans, you remember the President Nixon promised to remove cancer from our world in 10 years, and cancer is still with us and in a big way. Actually, it's #1 killer, even exceeding heart diseases and other vascular diseases in Israel for sure. I think that in the United States as well. It's still #1 killer. Many of the cancers are still increasing in incidence. Take, for example, pancreatic cancer. It's increasing in incidence, and we still don't understand why. And so you see, we still are lacking tools to make this prediction, and medicine probably will be with us and for the next foreseeable future. Interestingly, when you look at the diseases that afflict us, and since I'm teaching in a medical school, and you ask, I always like to ask medical students what your career looks like. What do you want to be? 90% of them want to be either cardiologists or surgeons and gynecologists and so on. And so with the changing lifestyle, people also tend to what I call the softer part professions in medicine, like ophthalmology and dermatology. If you find one of them that is interested in public health, it's a miracle in epidemiology. None of them. But if you look at all these diseases, the big diseases, they're all preventable. So, I think that, and it makes much more sense to prevent disease and to understand epidemiology rather than treating disease, because treating disease is, in most cases, too late. So think about the lady on the left side, obesity and the hypertension, all the metabolic diseases that it brings. It's in our hands. And think about behavioral diseases like smoking in the lower left side. It's all manageable. Think about the environment, the industry. Well, it's not in the hands of the individual, but it's certainly in the hands of the country, of the state, of collaboration, emission of carbon dioxide and so on, our fight in climate change, which probably has huge effects on our health, and this is a subject of itself for a lecture, and even genetics. We are on the way. When we studied medicine, I say, me and my colleagues, genetics was like God's hand. I mean, that's it. We have nothing to do. We couldn't even diagnose it, and nowadays we can treat it. Think about diseases that we are already approaching, the single mutational diseases like sickle cell anemia or spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, and so on. We are already able to approach genetic diseases molecularly, and I believe that the range will expand dramatically. So medicine, I think, nowadays is in a crossroad, and certainly personalized medicine is a big advance. We look at it from time to time in a kind of a magic way, like a revolution. It's not a revolution. It's a technological step forward, and I'll show you how it came. It's just, science-enabled medicine, or together, they enable one another to make this advance. It's all based on our ability to look not only into the genome, but also into the transcriptome and the proteome and the metabolome, and to profile patients exactly according to the biochemical profile. So it's all technological advances that occurred along the recent decades. So it's not some buzzword or something that erupted into our world all of a sudden without knowing what it is. It's just using the potential of technology. So medicine, as you all know, is moving in certain directions nowadays. Engineering, I mean classical engineering, I wouldn't say that we are very successful in it. We are able to replace joints with metal joints. We are able to replace heart valves, but we are not really there as far as the complicated organs. For example, artificial heart, total failure, colossal failure. From the days of Koloff and others, nothing. We have few transient devices, but that's it. We need to transplant heart if we want to rescue the patient. There are no real artificial heart. We are using organ transplantation a lot, of course, with all the shortage of organs, kidney, lungs, heart, cornea, of course, that's easy. But artificial organs, classical engineering is a little bit limited to joints, to part of the vascular system, and so on and so forth. Then comes, of course, what we call genetic engineering, and that's in a move. We are still not there. I don't know of any real diseases that is treated by genetic engineering, replacing cells. Many attempts are being made on Parkinson's diseases, designing catecholamines secreting cells in the substantia nigra. Diabetes, of course, is an unbelievable candidate for cells that secrete regulated secretion of insulin, and the problem is just implanting them. We can implant them in the hand. I mean, we don't care as long as insulin will respond. But amazingly, 20 years after the pioneers of genetic engineering like John Gurdon and then Shinya Yamanaka came to the world, we are still not there, but I believe that the technology will come. And of course, the drug industry, which is still with us in a big way. So I will try to concentrate only on the history of drugs, and because we are time limited. And so the first revolution in drug development was the era of incidental discovery. So people didn't mean to discover drugs, but they did discover real blockbusters. And the first blockbusters is, of course, aspirin. If you think about aspirin, I will not go. The history of aspirin is amazing. Many books have been written of it. It was discovered actually by a Jewish scientist working in Bayer, in a German company, and his name was somehow kind of pushed away. His name was Arthur Eichengrun. He's on the left side. It was taken away by Felix Hoffmann, though the name is kind of Jewish. He's not a Jew. But it was part of the German propaganda and so on. I will not go into this sad part of the history, but it's going back to the Egyptian history 4,000 years ago. And the Egyptians already reported that chewing the willow barks that grew on the banks of the Nile River alleviates pain. And it took 4,000 years to isolate the material, and at the end of the turn of the 19th century, people isolated salicin, which was extremely bitter, could not be used. And the Egyptians discovered that chewing it has pain-relieving properties, but then it was left. And Bayer isolated the material. Actually, it was not Bayer, it was French and other German scientists, and Bayer bought it later. And then Bayer changed the material by acetylating it. It's acetyl salicylic acid. They managed somehow, in a miracle, to remove the bitterness without affecting the pain-relieving attributes of aspirin, of salicylic acid. And because typically when you are taking, for example, morphine, and you are trying to separate the addictive properties from the pain-relieving properties, it's a colossal failure. The same for steroids. Try to take away the side effect of steroids from their beneficial effect. Failure. People have invested huge efforts in that. But in that case, they were lucky, and they developed a pain reliever. And when they made, by the way, the father of Felix Hoffmann was sick with rheumatoid arthritis, and when they gave it to him to relieve the pain, they discovered that it also relieves the inflammation. So they said to Bayer, listen guys, we have not only a pain reliever and a fever reliever, but we have also an anti-inflammatory drug, and aspirin became a very strong anti-inflammatory drug, and it became probably one of the most, the best-selling drug in the world in terms of weight, not in terms of price. In terms of weight, nowadays, still aspirin is being sold in many tons a year. Amazing. And then other properties of aspirin were discovered, of course, the anticoagulation effect, and it was given, well, we are not using aspirin today because of side effects, but Plavix and other drugs to prevent second myocardial infarction and coagulation. And of course, 100 years after Paul Ehrlich, the anti-inflammatory properties of aspirin are being used to prevent cancer in specific cases when there is a history, specifically of colorectal carcinoma in the family, and it became probably the best chemopreventive drug in the world, and experiments, trials are still going on. Of course, there are doubts whether aspirin should be taken prophylactically for people that didn't suffer from myocardial infarction or do not have any family indication. This is still under debate, and every year you'll open the New England Journal of Medicine, you'll find one paper for, one paper against, and it's still going on. But aspirin went well beyond its original discovery hopes. But it was serendipitous discovery based on an Egyptian. The second drug that was discovered by serendipity is, of course, penicillin. And you can see not the original dish, but you can see the dish. The original dish is in the Science Museum in London. I must tell you, I was almost in tears seeing it, of Alexander Fleming, the British microbiologist that discovered, and what he left by chance in the summer of 23, if I remember well, an open dish with E. coli growing on it, and a fungus that was in the air was falling, grew on the media. And what you see the halo between the fungal colony and the bacterial smear. And he surmised that the fungal colony secretes a material that he called antibiotics, anti against bios life. He was not a chemist, he was a microbiologist, and he took Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, another Jew that escaped Germany during the rise of the Nazis to power, to purify penicillin. And penicillin was already used during the World War II, and especially during the invasion of the Allies to Normandy, and saved the lives of numerous soldiers. And based on the principle that the fungus, in order to protect itself, secretes an antibacterial material, Selman Waxman in New Jersey, in Rutgers University, discovered streptomycin, secreted by another fungus, Streptomyces, and the world has changed forever. Now, of course, we are synthesizing antibiotics. We don't need bacteria to secrete it. It's a very complex synthetic process, but nevertheless, we can do it. And you should invite next time Ada Yonat to tell you about the world of limitations of antibiotics resistance and the availability of antibiotics. But this was another example of serendipitous discovery. Of course, medicine, with the development of science, we cannot rely on serendipitous, and the world moved into the world of screening. And the screening, again, it's a technological advance. It's a marriage between two technologies. One technology is, of course, disease modeling, especially in tissue culture. We are able to grow cells from different diseases in tissue culture. And the other, the bridegroom or the bride, however you look at on this marriage, is, of course, synthetic organic chemistry, where people are able to synthesize materials, and they leave on the route numerous intermediates, and there are huge libraries of compounds, and you can use brute force in order to see whether one drug will fit into whatever element in the disease, in the pathological process, and affect it for the good. So you walk today into any facility of a big company or any company, and you'll see these robots that are taking samples from chemical libraries and cells from the other side, mix them together. The next day, the cells are going to the microscope. I'm just oversimplifying it. Let's say that it's an anti-cancer drug, and you see a drug that inhibits cell growth. Of course, it's not a drug. Basically, it's not even a lead. It's the very beginning of drug development. But the basis is, of course, a screening. We have no clue about the mechanism. We don't know the target. We don't know anything. We are just screening. Today, of course, things have been changed, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but we are still using it. And I think that one of the famous drugs that have been developed based on screening are statins. Statins were developed by Akira Endo. He got the Lasker Award, the medical Lasker Award, a few years ago for his discovery. He was a pharmacist working in a pharmaceutical Japanese company, and he screened the library of Japanese plant compounds, 10,000, and the output assay was, of course, synthesis of radio-labeled cholesterol. So this was the assay, and he discovered one drug, and then Park Davis in the United States bought it, and the history of statins is well known. They are now very effective statins. The mechanism has been deciphered. It's an effective inhibitor of the first rate-limiting enzyme in the biosynthetic pathway of cholesterol, HMG-CoA reductase, and it became not the drug that is being sold most by tons, but by dollars. The sales last year exceeded $40 billion. It's a huge drug in the market. But again, we cannot, people then discovered that even systematic screening is not good enough, and the reasons are complicated, and we entered a new era of personalized or precise medicine. Actually, Lee Hood, that is kind of the spiritual father of this revolution, it's very identified these days to identify parents, for legal parents of revolutions, called it the revolution of 4 Ps, personalized or precise, predictive, preventive, and participatory. And each of them is a very important element, and I will concentrate later on mostly on the participatory. And participatory means the participation of the patient in the decision-making process. I remember when we studied medicine decades ago, the doctor or the physician was a god. Trust me, I'm your doctor. Don't ask me questions. Anyway, there was no source for questions. There was no internet, no computers. People were unknowledgeable about disease processes, and the doctor was kind of the supreme authority in the decision-making process. But the participation has now become really an important part of the process. And the reason I think the question started already to come up with the issues of you take a group of patients that are diagnosed at the same day with the same disease and actually the same state of the disease, and then you see them diverging into 2 main groups. One group start to deteriorate and at the end die, depends on the disease, and the other group is getting treatment and is being cured or carrying on chronic disease. And people wondered, what is it? And the reason is, of course, simple. I don't know, you, the epigenetic experts, will tell me. I don't know that there are 2 individuals that walk on the face of Earth that are completely identical to one another, not even identical twins, due to epigenetic changes. So no wonder that we are different, and the disease has different sources. We are males and females, tall and short, fat and thin, living under different diets, and of course carrying different genetic repertoire. So no wonder that what we call a disease is not actually a disease. It's a symptomatology. It's the phenotype, but it's not I wouldn't call it genotype. It's not the mechanistic part of the disease, and therefore the response is of course different. And I think that the attitude of medicine until the beginning of the 21st century, in retrospect, is mistaken, is really mistaken. We are using what I called one size fits all rather than individualized medicine, and now we wondered what happens, and that's what happens. But again, it's not us to be blamed, it's the lack of knowledge and lack of technology. And of course, the biggest development was, of course, the genome. I remember vividly the day that Nature published the first genome. It was in April of 2000, nearly 22 years ago. Actually, the completion of the genome was published in Science just a few weeks ago. I mean, the remaining part was just published. And this was, of course, the opening to a whole technology that you all know that is going to transcriptomic and proteomics and metabolomics and profiling. All the other technologies are still behind. Transcriptomic is moving ahead very quickly, but proteomics, we are still behind in sensitivity, the accuracy and so on, but it's really coming forward. And we are able to really profile the patient and to know much better on the disease. So we are moving from one size fits all medicine into kind of a tailor-made medicine. And I think that the mirror of medicine is turning from disease to disease within the context of a patient. So you all know about it, and it's easy also to understand, and it's all based on a technology. And breast cancer is one example. We know now several types of breast cancer. We know the EGFR that is treating with Herceptin. We know the estrogen receptor that is treating with tamoxifen, the progesterone receptor. We know, unfortunately, the triple negative, but triple negative is a cancer. So there is something, and we know some mutations that are part of the triple negative, but I believe that under the box of triple negative, there are other signaling pathways that are mutated, and people are on the way to discover them by building the bank and sequencing lots of patients in order to map, to stratify the disease. So we talked about Herceptin, and so, but we forgot the adverse drug reaction. You know, this is something that is really behind us. We think only of diseases, but think about reactions to drugs. I mean, it's not only sensitivity to penicillin and a little bit of a rash. People are dying of anaphylactic shock. I mean, the side effects and also the balance between the side effect and the beneficial effect. Think about chemotherapy. and what's going on there. And I'm not talking about even more severe, as I said, the deleterious and deadly side effects. And they're also embedded somehow in our information, especially side effects that are patient-specific. You know, not all patients are sensitive to penicillin or to other antibiotics, and we are starting to develop tools. And people think that fatal ADRs or adverse drug appear to be between 4th and 6th of leading cause of death in America. So it's really a big problem, and I think that the ability to profile the patient is also going to solve this problem that is kind of stayed away from us. We didn't think about it because we are thinking only diseases, but we are inflicting the iatrogenic effect of drugs is a major problem in medicine. So of course, the human genome was the very beginning, and now we are building genome atlases of all the diseases, and it's a beautiful example of international collaboration. And of course, it covers all the layers, initially the classical layers, but now also other layers of the central dogma of biology, the flow of information for DNA all the way to small molecules, non-coding RNA, and so on and so forth. So there are microRNA, there are many layers in between, and we are not going to discuss it, just to show you the complexity of what we are analyzing these days. Now I want to come to the other part in order to, before concluding, and that of course the ethical issues that are embedded there, and they are extremely heavy, and we put very little time in thinking of that. We are always kind of keeping away. Canonical medicine is based on 3 pillars, and it's the patient, the disease, and the treatment, of course. But these are all going to change in a big way. The disease, you know, from the patient in the left side, that the old physicians are measuring the pulse, to molecular diseases that are, we are not only have breast cancer or prostate cancer, or we have a mutation or an aberration in one of the processes that is well diagnosed, and we are using very different tools. People might argue that, of course, physical diagnosis and the story of the patient are extremely important, but we should admit that's good for the patient-physician's relationship, but we are moving away from it in very ways, and you will find the doctor in the clinic, my own personal physician, is not looking at me. Well, from time to time he does, but he's sitting in front of the computer. All the information is a computer. So the whole thing, you know, people are asking me from time to time, tell me, Aaron, personalized medicine is going to be more personal? So they think that I say no, it's going to be much cooler and much more technological rather than personal. So maybe we should really move to President Obama term, precise medicine rather than personalized medicine. It's not going to be a personal at all. So now let's go to the disease. We are still in the disease. We have biomarkers that are able to predict diseases. Remember, one of the 4 Ps is not only precise and personalized, but it's also predictive. If a marker is being found nowadays circulating in my blood, let it be circulating cancer cell or even circulating DNA, and the marker predicts a disease, am I sick? Now, it's a very fundamental question, not only for me to do something about it if I can, but for the insurance company, for the family, for the employer, for everybody that is surrounding me. Carrying a marker is a disease or not a disease. Or let's say that we are sequencing the entire small, nice audience that is sitting in this hall and finding a mutation in TP53 or in what other. Are you sick or aren't you sick? And what is the meaning of the statistics? So you see that the meaning of the disease is not like having high fever and not being able to get up in the morning and to go to work, but it's really broadening in a big way, and the big way have huge implications both to the patients and to the entire ecosystem in which the patient is living. Now, who is the patient? The patient is the sick patient, or the patient is the embryo, or the egg, or the sperm, and the embryo at what stage? We can, we are also already dissociating in many ways the family structure, because reproduction is starting to take apart from family, from the canonical family. We can do an IVF. The IVF can involve either the sperm and the egg of the two parents, but we have a surrogate mother that's as close to the canonical family as possible, but it can be an egg or a sperm taken from another parent, or both of them are taken from other parents and implanted in the mother. I mean, the variation is huge in that sense, and it imposes huge moral implications and ethical implications, societal, genetic, however you look at it. So the definition of the patient, of course, is going to change, and of course the treatment is going to change, because we just talked a few minutes ago on CRISPR, and CRISPR is coming up, and it's already being used in a very limited way, but it is going to be used. So we are also deviating from the treatment. And, this slide, I have two versions for this slide. The rest of the world version and the Chinese version. When I lecture in China, Genkei He is out. They really don't want to hear about it. He was just released a few weeks ago from jail. This is the Chinese guy in Shenzhen Technological University that did the experiment on the two girls that are nicknamed by the Nana and Lulu. And he tried to remove from them the receptor for the AIDS receptor, because the father had AIDS and the mother too. And he wanted to be heroic. His face were looking into Stockholm. I will not go. It's a very complicated affair. And the Chinese, realizing the disaster, actually, I suspect and almost know that the Chinese supported him in the view into Stockholm, but then when they realized how bad it is perceived by the world, they kicked him into the jail. Well, we are in a different world, and he was just released. And of course, it was an experiment that was completely rejected. He was not successful. There was the off-target effects, and in one of the children, he removed only one of the gene, so he left her with haploinsufficient. I will not go into all this. It was too premature, but at least somebody, you can say, tried it, and we are going to try. I just had a symposium with Jennifer Doudna, and things are moving ahead as far as treatment is concerned. So let's just try to conclude this whole thing with the obstacles on this revolution. I will not go through all of them. Of course, there are many obstacles there. Many of the diseases are multigenic, so this is not a single mutation. Many of the metabolic diseases are, and especially the psychiatric diseases, what we call the spectrum, are multigenic, so touching all the genes, knowing who is the driver, who is the hitchhiker, who is the passenger, is a little bit complicated. The issue of human experimentation, and so on. In cancer, of course, the issue of genome instability, one of the hallmarks. If you read the famous 3 articles on the hallmark of cancer, 2 of them came from Bob Weinberg and Doug Anahan. The recent one, published a few months ago, came only from Doug Anahan. I wonder where Bob disappeared. Are pointing to genome instability. So you are treating the disease with one drug, and then the patient responds, and then another mutation shows up. So it's not so simple. The issue of price is extremely important, because the diseases are going to be stratified. The era of blockbuster drugs is going to begin soon. So there will be no blockbuster drugs, because if you are going to have 20 or 15 or 10 breast cancers rather than one, then we need more drugs, the development of the drugs and so on. And the market share is going to be divided, and the companies are certainly not happy about it, but that's reality. And the issue of price is not only an issue on developed country, but mostly on developing country. The accessibility to drugs and the inability. Look what happened with COVID-19 immunization. There are parts of the world that the immunization rate is nothing, like 2 to 3%. Go to poor African country. I mean, it's none. It's none. The people are dying you think about it, about vaccination to COVID-19. It looks to me like an old Greek or Roman history nowadays. And nevertheless, there are still people in the world that have not seen it even and don't dream to see it. So the issue of accessibility is a very heavy ethical issue. But the last one is the bioethical issue and the availability of genetic information. And genetic information will be easily available. The literature already started. This is from Nature, and others start to deal with it. All of you are leaving your DNA behind you. Well, these chairs don't have armchairs, but I can tell you that in halls, in lecture halls that have armchairs, if somebody will smear it with an alcohol before you enter and come back after you leave the hall, he'll have the DNA of every single one of you coming from the shedded keratinocytes from your skin. So how do we keep it? And the genetic information has a lot of meaning. First of all, whether we ourselves want to know it, but a stage will come that we shall not be asked, because the insurance company would like to ask, and even you might be interested, because insurance nowadays is kind of a risk division industry. They take me and they say, okay, Aaron, you're 70 plus, and you have a risk of that or that, so your insurance policy will be like that. But if I have no mutation to any risky diseases, and my life expectancy is still in the range of 10 or 15 years, maybe my neighbor who is already stricken with cancer and heart disease and starting to be dementic, why should I share with him the insurance if I can pay $1 and he should pay $10,000 rather than each of us paying $5,000? So the insurance, so we ourselves might be interested in that. Our spouses, our future spouses may be interested in that. And here I'm touching a very sensitive issue. We are already getting married in cycles. Let's don't be naive. Let it be religious cycle, let it be intellectual cycle, let it be socio-economic cycle, let it be skin color cycle. We are limiting ourselves. So why we should not limit ourselves also to a genetic cycle and have our spouses being tested and we tested, and then we shall decide what do we want. We want children made just by the father, just by the mother, by both of them, and by none of us, or take apart, or whatever. So this is not such a far remote issue. And be prepared for the big genome leak, of course, how to store this information from not only from computer hackers, but again, from the government. Maybe the government may be interested, insurance companies, spouses, employers, and so on. So the issue of availability of information becomes really an issue on the table. It's not only an issue for criminals and for ransom, but it's an issue that really sits on our table as scientists and as physicians. And to conclude with Angelina Jolie, of course, the BRCA1, the famous breast cancer and ovarian cancer gene. I would say that this gene that was discovered by a good friend of mine, by Mary Claire King from University of Washington in Seattle, kind of ushered in the era of genetic testing. And Angelina Jolie discovered that her mother and aunt, the sister of the mother, got both breast cancer, one of them breast cancer and another one ovarian cancer. She was tested positive and did really a major operation. She took off her breast and then her ovaries. Nowadays, the policy changed. They don't take the breast anymore, or this is the recommendation, only the ovaries. But nevertheless, she left half of the question open because there are children around. So what to do, of course, with the children if the gene was inherited. So you see that even if you have money and you have good doctors, this still doesn't solve the longitudinal question. So I think, to conclude, I think that we should rather think a lot about the issues that are behind, just beside, what the sequence of the DNA and the transcriptome and the metabolome and the proteome tell us, because at the end of the day, we should not forget for a minute, we are all human beings. And just the fact that we are convening here today physically is the best testimony to our basic needs to see and to talk to one another in eyes height. And medicine clearly touches this issue and this aspect in a very deep way. It has been so, and it will remain so, because the sick patient will always be a sick patient, and the ethical issues that bother him and us should be on the table as much as the big scientific problems that bother us and the scientific problems that actually bring these ethical issues up. Thank you very much.